You know, most folks think working in a cemetery is creepy. They picture fog, shadows, and maybe a hunchbacked guy with a shovel. But let me tell you, that's Hollywood nonsense. For 12 years, Oak Ridge Memorial was the quietest, most peaceful place I'd ever known. It was beautiful, honestly. Rolling hills, ancient oaks that were probably 200 years old, and monuments that told stories better than any history book. My name is Mike Riley, and I was the groundskeeper. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was honest. I mowed, I trimmed, I made sure the granite markers stood straight, and I supervised every single hole that went into the ground. I was good at it. I had a respect for the place. See, the living, they come and go. They weep, they leave flowers, they forget. But the dead, they're permanent residents. They deserve dignity. My job was to maintain that dignity. I took the job after my own life got complicated. A messy divorce, a layoff from the factory downtown. I needed quiet. I needed simple. And Oak Ridge provided that in spades. My boss was Frank, an old-timer who smelled perpetually of diesel fuel and stale coffee. Frank had been running the place since the Nixon administration. He had 2 rules: keep the grass short and never, ever let a grave site look messy for a family visit. "Mike," Frank used to grumble, peering over his glasses at me, "we sell peace here. You mess up the dirt, you mess up the peace." And I agreed. The process was sacred. When someone passed, we'd get the orders. We'd mark the spot. The backhoe would dig the hole, usually 6 feet deep, sometimes deeper for historical plots or vaults. Then came the concrete vault, which is basically a sealed box the casket goes into. It's what keeps the earth from collapsing onto the coffin. We were very meticulous about that vault, making sure it was level and properly seated. Then, once the funeral was over, we'd fill the hole, tamp the dirt down tight, lay the sod on top, and place the marker. Done. Closed. Finished. The whole point of the vault and the tamping is that the grave stays closed. Permanently. Sure, the soil settles a little over the next few weeks, especially after a big rain, but it's a gradual, predictable process. You might need to add a couple of scoops of dirt, but that's it. It stays closed, except for one. This all started in late September, right when the air was getting that sharp apple cider smell, and the leaves were just starting to turn gold. We had a burial for a young man named Elias Thorne. Early 20s, car accident, sudden, awful tragedy. We had done the prep work near the old section, Lot 44. It was a nice spot, under a young maple. The funeral was quiet. Small crowd. Lots of tears. It's always the worst when they're young. I watched them drive away, and then Frank and I got to work closing the grave. We lowered the vault, sealed the casket inside, and then I went to work with the backhoe, pushing the excavated earth back into the hole. I took extra care with Elias's grave. I always did with the young ones. I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. I spent an hour tamping the dirt down with the mechanical tamper, making the mound firm and tight. I smoothed it over, laid the perfect squares of fresh sod, watered it thoroughly, and placed the temporary marker. "Looks good, Mike," Frank said, wiping sweat off his brow. "Tight as a drum. That soil ain't going nowhere." "Nope," I replied. "He's settled." That was a Tuesday. I spent Wednesday fixing some irrigation issues on the far side of the park. Thursday morning, when I drove my little utility cart past Lot 44, I stopped. The grave looked wrong. Now, remember what I said about settling? It happens, but it's slow. It's a gentle dip, a slight softening of the mound. This wasn't a dip. This was a rise. The mound of earth over Elias Thorne's grave was slightly higher than I had left it. Not dramatically, maybe just an inch or two, but enough that the perfectly laid squares of sod looked strained, almost stretched. It looked taut, like the ground was holding its breath. I frowned. Maybe I hadn't tamped it as well as I thought. Maybe the rain we got overnight had swelled the clay underneath. That happens sometimes. I pulled out my steel rake and my tamping pole. I peeled back the sod gently, trying not to tear it. The dirt underneath was firm but definitely higher. I spent 20 minutes walking over the plot, pressing down with my full weight, pushing the soil back into submission. I added a little fresh topsoil to smooth out the edges, relaid the sod, and gave it another drink of water. "Silly dirt," I muttered to myself. "You gotta stay put." I told Frank about it later that afternoon. He just shrugged. The clay in that section is tricky, Mike. Absorbs water like a sponge. Give it a week, it'll settle down." I accepted that. Frank knew the ground better than anyone. He could probably smell the difference between loam and silt. Friday came and went. I checked Lot 44 twice. It looked fine. The mound was still firm. The sod was holding. I thought, okay, problem solved. It was just the weather and the clay. Then came Monday morning. I had the weekend off, which meant nobody but the occasional visitor had been on the property. I clocked in at 6 a.m. before the sun was fully up and started my usual rounds, checking for fallen branches or anything out of place. When I reached Lot 44, my gut twisted into a knot. It wasn't just higher this time. It was actively disturbed. The mound was significantly raised, maybe 4 or 5 inches higher than when I left it on Friday. But worse than the height, the beautiful sod I had laid was torn. Not just pulled apart at the seams where the squares met, but actually ripped through the middle of the grass itself, like something heavy had been dragged across it. And the dirt underneath was scattered. It looked exactly like a dog had been digging, except there wasn't a single paw print anywhere, and the entire area was fenced off. Plus, the amount of dirt displaced was too much for a dog. It looked like the ground had erupted. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, staring. I felt a cold prickle start at the base of my neck. This wasn't settling. Ground settling doesn't tear sod. Ground settling doesn't throw dirt sideways. I knelt down, brushing away some of the loose soil. The dirt beneath was hard, packed clay, but the top layer was loose, almost fluffy, as if it had been aerated from below. I started to panic slightly. Had someone tried to dig the body up? Grave robbers? In Oak Ridge? It was unheard of. But if it was a person, where were the footprints? The disturbed area was confined perfectly to the dimensions of the grave itself. I drove back to the shed, grabbed my heaviest tamping bar, a 6-foot steel beast, and a fresh load of topsoil. Frank was already there, nursing his first cup of coffee. "Morning, Mike. What's the rush?" "Frank, you gotta come see Lot 44. It's messed up again. Worse than before." Frank sighed, finished his coffee, and slowly climbed into his pickup truck. We drove over together. Frank stepped out, squinted at the grave, and took off his faded baseball cap, scratching his bald head. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's aggressive settling." "Aggressive?" "Frank, the sod is ripped. Look at this." I pointed to a particularly deep tear near the temporary marker. "And look how high the dirt is. It looks like someone pushed it up from the inside." Frank bent down, examining the edges. Okay. Maybe a water main burst nearby? No, the ground's dry. Maybe some heavy equipment drove too close and the vibration shifted the vault? We didn't have any heavy equipment over the weekend, Frank, and even if we did, the vault is below 6 feet of packed clay. It weighs 2,000 pounds. It doesn't just shift enough to push the surface dirt up half a foot. We both knew it was ridiculous. The pressure required to displace that much earth and tear the sod was immense. Frank pulled a cigar stub out of his pocket, chewed on it thoughtfully, and finally said, "Look, Mike, I don't like it, but we can't have it looking like this. The family might come by today. We need to close it again. Pack it down hard this time. Use the vibratory plate compactor. That ought to teach it a lesson." The vibratory plate compactor was serious business. It's what you use for paving roads. It shakes the ground so hard you can feel it in your teeth. It was overkill for a grave, but I was desperate to make the problem go away. I spent the next 2 hours on Lot 44. I used the backhoe bucket to scrape away the loose, disturbed soil. I ran the plate compactor over the area repeatedly until the ground was dense and hard as rock. I added more fresh soil, packing it down with the tamper until my arms ached. I replaced the torn sod with new, perfect squares. When I was done, you couldn't tell anything had ever been wrong. The grave was flat, tight, and perfect. If I had been selling peace before, I was selling absolute, total, immovable permanence now. There, I gasped, wiping the sweat and dirt off my face. That's done. If that ground moves again, I'm calling a geologist. Frank chuckled, but it sounded forced. Good work, Mike. Just keep an eye on it. Let's hope young Elias is finally resting easy. I watched Lot 44 like a hawk for the rest of the week. I drove by every hour. I walked over it, testing the firmness of the sod with my boots. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, nothing. It was flat. It was quiet. The sun shone, the maple leaves turned red, and the cemetery was back to its usual peaceful self. I started to relax. It must have been the clay, or maybe a freak-localized tremor we didn't feel. Something natural. Something explainable. Then Friday morning arrived. I was getting ready to start the mower when Frank came running into the shed. And when I say Frank ran, I mean he was moving faster than I'd seen him move in a decade. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and he was holding his hands up like he'd seen a ghost, which, considering where we worked, was saying something. "Mike, Lot 44, get your butt over there, now!" My blood ran cold instantly. I grabbed my keys and jumped into the cart. We sped toward the section. As soon as we rounded the bend, I saw it. It was no longer a mound. It was a hill. It was almost a foot high, maybe more. The soil wasn't just pushed up, it looked like it had been violently extruded. The fresh sod I had worked so hard to lay was not just ripped. It was thrown off the grave entirely, lying in scattered, curled-up pieces around the perimeter. And the dirt itself was wet, not from rain, but from deep underground moisture. It was dark, rich, almost black earth, the kind that hasn't seen the sun in years, mixed with pale gray clay. But the worst part wasn't the height or the mess. It was the shape. The mound was perfectly rectangular, following the lines of the concrete vault beneath. It looked like a giant subterranean hand was pressing against the lid, pushing the entire column of earth above it straight toward the sky. I slammed on the brakes. We both just sat there, breathing hard. "Mike," Frank whispered, his voice shaking. "Did you see anybody here this morning?" "Frank, nobody could do this. Not with a shovel, not with a backhoe. It's too uniform. It's too forceful." We got out of the cart and walked slowly toward the plot. The dirt looked fresh, wet, almost steaming in the early morning air. I knelt down, running my hand over the soil. It was loose, like it had just been broken apart. I looked at Frank. He was white as a sheet, staring down at the ground he thought he knew so well. "The compactor," I said, my voice hoarse. "We used the compactor. That ground was solid rock. It couldn't have settled naturally." "No," Frank agreed, shaking his head slowly. "No way. Not like this. This is like something is trying to get out." The thought hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Something is trying to get out. We had to dig it up. There was no other choice. If the vault had cracked, or if the internal pressure was somehow causing this, we had to fix it before the Thorne family visited again. And frankly, I needed to see what was causing this impossible displacement. We got the backhoe and started to carefully scoop away the disturbed earth. We worked slowly, meticulously, removing the dirt layer by layer until we got back down to the packed clay level I had compacted on Monday. The clay was cracked. Not just hairline fractures, but deep spiderwebbing fissures radiating out from the center of the grave site. "Look at that, Frank," I pointed. "That's where the pressure came from. It broke the clay seal." We kept digging, 4 feet down, 5 feet down. The deeper we went, the wetter the soil became, and the stronger the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old flowers. Finally, we hit the heavy gray concrete of the vault lid. We cleared the last layer of muck off the top of the vault. It was a standard sealed unit built to withstand tons of pressure. It was meant to be the end of the story. But when we looked down, the vault was not level. It had shifted. The entire massive concrete box, designed to sit motionless forever, had been pushed up on one side. It was clearly angled, tilted maybe 3 or 4 inches higher on the east side than the west. And right where the tilt was highest, there was a fresh, bright white scratch mark running diagonally across the dark gray concrete, maybe a foot long. Frank gasped. "How in the hell?" "Frank, it's not just shifted," I said, pointing at the seal. "Look at the seal." The vault wasn't just a lid, it was a 2-piece unit that sealed tightly around the casket. The seal was supposed to be perfect, waterproof, airtight. But on the high side, where the scratch was, the seal was broken. A tiny dark gap, maybe 1/8 of an inch wide, ran along the joint. And from that gap, a thin stream of sticky black liquid was weeping out, staining the side of the vault. It smelled awful, like rot, but sharp, like chemicals mixed with decay. Frank backed away quickly, almost stumbling. "Get that thing open, Mike, now. We need to see what's inside. Maybe a pipe burst under the vault and the water pressure." He was grasping at straws, and we both knew it. No water pipe could lift a 2-ton concrete box and scratch the surface. I used the backhoe chains to carefully hook onto the lifting points of the vault lid. I set the tension and started to pull, slowly, smoothly. The hydraulics whined, and the earth around the grave groaned under the stress. The lid lifted, agonizingly slow. The smell that hit us was instantaneous and overwhelming. It wasn't the smell of decay, it was worse. It was the smell of damp earth and something that shouldn't be breathing, something that was trapped and fighting. We peered down into the darkness of the open vault. It was deep, maybe 4 feet down to the casket. The light was poor, so I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight. I aimed the beam down. The casket was a mahogany veneer, standard issue. It looked fine, mostly, but the lid of the casket was warped. It wasn't flat. It bowed upward, straining the brass fittings. And then I saw the mud. Thick, dark mud, mixed with that black seepage, was caked all over the top of the mahogany coffin. It looked like the coffin had been dragged through wet dirt. But how? The coffin was inside a sealed concrete vault. The earth was outside. My flashlight beam caught something else, something that made my stomach drop out. On the lid of the casket, near where the head would be, there were 5 distinct marks, pressed deeply into the wood finish. They were parallel, curved, and deep enough to break the veneer. They were fingernail marks, or something that looked exactly like them. Frank leaned over the edge, saw the marks, and let out a sound that was half cough, half choked scream. "Get it out, Mike! Get the box out! Now!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. I didn't argue. I quickly rigged the chains to the handles of the casket. This was delicate work. If I dropped it, the whole thing would be ruined. Slowly, carefully, I used the backhoe to lift the mahogany box out of the concrete vault. As the casket cleared the edge of the vault, we saw the full extent of the damage. The bottom of the casket, which should have been clean and dry, was coated in the same thick black mud and seepage. And the bottom panel itself was cracked, running from the center out toward the feet. It wasn't a clean break. It looked like something heavy had stomped on the inside, pushing down and cracking the wood. We set the coffin down on the grass next to the open pit. Frank stared at it, breathing heavily, completely defeated. "Mike," he whispered, "this is impossible. The vault was sealed. The casket was closed. There's no way mud got in, and there's no way that wood cracked like that unless someone was still alive inside, fighting their way out. But Elias Thorne was dead." We saw the death certificate. The funeral director sealed the box. I walked around the open vault, shining my light down into the concrete tomb. The inside was dirty from the seepage, but otherwise intact. Wait, no, it wasn't intact. On the interior wall of the vault, deep in the gray concrete, there were scrape marks, long, ragged furrows that ran horizontally, several inches deep in the cement. They started near the floor and ran up to about the height of the casket lid. These weren't scratches. These were gouges. And they weren't caused by the casket being lowered. They looked like something with incredible strength had been trapped inside and had used every ounce of its power to claw at the walls, trying to push its way free. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The pressure wasn't coming from a burst pipe or from settling clay or from vibration. The pressure was coming from within the vault. The concrete hadn't shifted. It had been pushed. The soil hadn't swelled. It had been pushed up by the tilting of the massive vault lid. Something had woken up inside that sealed concrete box, and it was desperately trying to escape. "We have to call someone, Frank," I said, my voice barely a croak. "The police, the medical examiner, we have to open the casket." Frank looked at the damaged coffin, then at the gouged concrete vault, then back at the exposed, cracked earth. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack right there on the grass. "Mike, you don't understand," he said, shaking his head frantically. "If we open that box and Elias Thorne is not resting, if he's wrong, if this gets out, Oak Ridge is finished. We are finished. Nobody will ever buy a plot here again." "Frank, there are claw marks on the inside of the vault. The man's coffin is cracked. If he was alive when we buried him, he wasn't. He couldn't be." The doctor signed off. Frank grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, Mike. We are groundskeepers. We fix the ground. We fix the mess. We do not expose the dead. We close it. We seal it. We make it perfect again. We say nothing." "But Frank, this isn't a mess. This is horrifying." "It is a mess, Mike, and we are going to make it go away." Frank's eyes were wild, but his voice was firm, laced with the desperation of a man trying to save his entire life's work. We lift the casket out. We replace the damaged vault with a new one. We put the casket back in. We reseal it. And we never speak of the scratches or the mud. We tell the family there was a small structural failure due to a manufacturing defect in the vault, and we fixed it immediately. Do you understand? We fix it. I looked down at the cracked mahogany coffin, the 5 distinct gouges mocking the peace and dignity I tried so hard to maintain. A cold sweat broke out all over me. The idea of putting that box back into the ground, knowing what I knew, made me feel physically sick. But Frank was my boss, and more than that, Frank was terrified. And I was beginning to realize that the one thing more terrifying than the idea of a man buried alive was the idea that something was trying to claw its way out of the grave, and we were the only ones who knew. "Okay, Frank," I finally choked out, my mouth dry. "We fix it. We make it perfect." That day was the longest day of my life. We had to call in a replacement vault under the strictest secrecy, telling the supplier it was a rush job due to a forklift accident. We dug the old, gouged vault out, a huge effort, and buried it in the back section of the property where only Frank and I ever went. We installed the new vault, meticulously leveling it. The hardest part was the casket. I had to clean the mud off the top of the coffin, carefully wiping away the black, sticky residue, trying not to look too closely at the deep fingernail marks. The cracked bottom was a major structural problem. We couldn't just seal it up broken. Frank found a heavy, dark wood filler and a stain that almost matched the mahogany. We patched the crack on the bottom as best we could, and then we laid thick, heavy blankets over the top of the coffin before lowering it back into the pristine new vault. We were protecting the fragile wood, Frank claimed, but we both knew we were trying to muffle whatever was inside. When we finally sealed the new vault, the air felt lighter, but the terror was heavier. We filled the hole, tamped the dirt, and laid the sod. Lot 44 was perfect again. Untouchable. Sealed. I left that evening feeling like I had committed a crime, but I had followed Frank's rule. I had maintained the peace. I promised myself I would check that grave every day, every hour if I had to. It was done. It was closed. There was no way anything could disturb that ground again. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, the ground started moving again. But this time, it wasn't just a mound. This time, the disturbance was so violent, so unnatural, it broke the temporary granite marker clean in half. And when I went to investigate, I didn't find mud. I found something else entirely, something that had definitely come from below. I left that evening feeling like I had committed a crime. But I had followed Frank's rule. I had maintained the peace. I promised myself I would check that grave every day, every hour if I had to. It was done. It was closed. There was no way anything could disturb that ground again. I was wrong. For the next 2 weeks, I was a wreck. I barely slept. Every morning before the sun rose, I drove my cart straight to Lot 44. I'd park, get out, and just stare. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, flat. Perfect. The new sod was taking hold beautifully. Frank had done a great job selling the lie to the supplier, and the new vault was immaculate. We had pushed the horror down, sealed it beneath 2 tons of concrete and 6 feet of packed earth. By the second week, I started to breathe again. Maybe the first vault truly had been defective. Maybe the pressure buildup was just a freak result of the earth shifting around a faulty seal. I was desperate for a normal explanation. I even stopped going by every hour. Twice a day felt sufficient. I started mowing again, trimming the hedges, doing the mundane, honest work that used to be my comfort. Then came Friday of the second week. October had settled in, and the mornings were crisp, smelling of burning leaves and dew. I pulled up to Lot 44 at 7:30 a.m. and stopped dead. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it felt like it plunged into a bucket of ice water. This wasn't settling. This wasn't a mound. This was violence. The entire plot looked like it had been hit by a mortar shell. The ground was split open in the center, a jagged, dark crack running the length of the grave. The beautiful new sod was not just ripped. It was shredded into green confetti and scattered 10 feet in every direction. But the most immediate, horrifying detail was the marker. We used temporary aluminum markers until the families ordered the permanent granite ones. Elias Thorne's marker was stuck into the ground near the head of the plot, or it had been. Now the aluminum stake was bent at a 90-degree angle, and the small granite plate, with his name and dates, the plate that was meant to rest peacefully on the earth, was snapped clean in half. It lay there, the break fresh and stark white against the black disturbed soil. The earth itself was pushed up even higher than the first time, maybe 18 inches, forming a sharp, ugly ridge, and the color was wrong. It wasn't just the dark topsoil and the pale clay. Mixed into the dirt were chunks of something else, something gray and gritty. I knelt down, trembling, and picked up a piece. It was concrete. Not the fine powder we sometimes mix into soil, but jagged, broken fragments. My mind raced. The new vault. It was supposed to be perfect, the strongest they made. I immediately drove back to the shed, ignoring the early visitors who were starting to wander in. Frank was just pouring his coffee. "Frank, Lot 44, it's gone crazy. The marker is broken, and there's concrete everywhere." Frank slopped coffee onto the floor. He didn't ask questions this time. He just dropped the mug, grabbed his keys, and we were back in the truck, speeding toward the site. When Frank saw the destruction, he didn't mutter or curse. He just made a high-pitched whimpering sound like an injured dog. "Oh, God, Mike. Oh, sweet mercy, no." He stumbled out of the truck, his face gray. He looked like he aged 10 years in 10 seconds. He bent down, picked up a piece of the broken marker, and just stared at it, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's fighting us, Mike," he whispered, his voice catching. "It's fighting to get out." "Frank, we have to call the police. Or the medical examiner. We can't hide this anymore. Whatever is happening, it's not natural. It's powerful enough to snap granite and crush a new vault." "No!" Frank shrieked, suddenly turning on me, his eyes wide and panicked. "We do not call anyone! Are you insane? If they find a broken vault and they open that casket, they'll find the gouges, they'll find the mud, they'll find the marks. Then we dig it up again. We check the new vault. We can't. The paperwork. We just reported replacing it. We can't replace it twice in 2 weeks. It'll raise every red flag in the county. He was shaking violently. Then what, Frank? What do? We can't just let the ground explode every few days. Frank looked around frantically, his eyes darting from the ravaged gravesite to the orderly, peaceful rows of headstones surrounding us. His reputation, his life's work, was literally being torn apart by the earth beneath his feet. "We stop it, Mike," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "We stop it permanently. We don't dig down. We press down, harder than ever before." He pointed toward the maintenance yard where we stored the large, uninstalled granite monuments and bases. "We need the Taggart base, the big one, the one for the mausoleum. It weighs 6,000 pounds. We put that directly on top of Lot 44. We tell everyone we're preparing a massive new family memorial plot. We hide it in plain sight." The Taggart base was enormous. It was a block of solid, polished gray granite, meant to anchor a huge, custom-built family mausoleum that had been delayed for years. It was so heavy we needed both the backhoe and the biggest forklift just to move it. It was insane. It was disrespectful. It was absolutely the only thing that might work. We spent the rest of the morning moving that immense piece of rock. We used every chain, every hydraulic lever, and every ounce of strength we had. We had to drag it across the pristine lawn, leaving deep trenches in the sod. But Frank didn't care. He was focused only on the final destination, Lot 44. When we finally maneuvered the 6,000-pound base over the erupted grave, positioning it exactly over the rectangle of disturbed earth, the ground groaned. I swear I felt a tremor run through the soles of my boots, even through the packed earth. We lowered the granite block slowly, carefully. When it finally settled, the sound was a deep, resonant thud that seemed to silence the entire cemetery. Silence. The massive block sat there, heavy, dark, and utterly immovable. "There," Frank gasped, leaning on the backhoe, sweat pouring off him despite the cool air. "That ought to hold him. Nothing is pushing that up." We spent the afternoon fixing the lawn around the new, sudden monument. We told the few curious workers that this was the start of a major new installation and that security needed to be tight. No one was to go near it. I went home that evening exhausted, but with a strange, grim certainty. We had won. The weight of that granite was final. The problem, though terrifying, was contained. I slept better than I had in 2 weeks. Saturday morning, I was back at Oak Ridge before 6 a.m. I drove straight to Lot 44. The first thing I noticed was the absolute silence. Not the usual peaceful silence of the cemetery, but a heavy, unnatural quiet. I approached the massive Taggart base. It looked exactly as we had left it, a huge, dark gray slab sitting on the green grass, solid, immovable. I walked the perimeter, checking the grass where it met the granite. Everything looked fine. The grass was crushed, but the ground was tight. I started to relax. We did it. We stopped it. Then I walked around to the head of the grave, and I stopped breathing. The Taggart base was so heavy that the granite itself was supposed to be immune to any force below. But right in the center of the slab, running about halfway across the width, was a crack. It was a fresh, clean break, maybe 1/4 of an inch wide, but definitely visible. It looked like a giant hammer had struck the center of the granite block and split it. I couldn't believe it. 6,000 pounds of solid granite, cracked, from below. I slowly circled the base, my legs numb. I was looking for the epicenter of the force, the spot where the vault might be pushing hardest. I found it on the east side, the same side where the first vault had tilted. The corner of the massive granite block was lifted, maybe 1/2 inch off the ground. The sheer weight of the base had settled slightly into the earth, but on this one corner, The ground was resisting, pushing back, and wedged directly under that raised corner was something thin, pale, and unmistakable. It was a piece of white fabric. I dropped to my knees, heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. I reached under the granite block and carefully pulled the fabric out. It was crisp, clean, and perfectly white. It was the lining of the casket, the expensive satin that cushioned the inside of the box. But it wasn't just pulled out. It was folded almost neatly at the end. And across the center of the fabric, smeared in that familiar, foul-smelling black seepage, was a single, perfect handprint. It was the size of a man's hand, but the fingers were long, thin, and stretched wide. The print was deep, as if the hand had been pressed into the fabric with desperate, incredible force. I stared at the handprint on the satin lining. It was too much. This wasn't structural failure. This wasn't settling. This wasn't even an animal digging. This was deliberate. This was intelligent. I dropped the fabric and scrambled backwards, stumbling over a flower vase. I looked up at the massive, cracked granite block. It wasn't containing anything. It was serving as a giant lid that whatever was beneath was simply pushing aside. And then I saw the final insult. Sitting perfectly centered on top of the massive Taggart base, where Frank and I would have to see it immediately, was the small aluminum temporary marker we had bent and thrown away a week ago. It wasn't just the granite plate with Elias Thorne's name. It was the entire stake, perfectly straightened out, clean of dirt, and placed like a business card on the table. It was a message. I didn't call Frank. Not yet. Frank would panic and demand we somehow hide the 6,000-pound cracked monument. I knew we couldn't hide it, and I knew we couldn't stop it. Whatever Elias Thorne was, he was not resting, and he was using monumental force to tell us so. I drove back to the shed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I locked the doors and sat in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. I needed help, professional help. Someone who understood death, or decomposition, or maybe even geology, but not the kind Frank studied. I needed someone who could look at a massive cracked granite block and a handprint on a burial shroud and not immediately call for a straitjacket. I thought about the Thorne family. I had to find them. Maybe they knew something about Elias. Maybe he had a medical condition, or maybe he wasn't really dead when they signed the papers. I pulled out the Oak Ridge files. Elias Thorne, Lot 44, died September 27th. Cause of death, massive trauma resulting from a single car accident, closed casket. I looked at the emergency contact. Martha Thorne, mother, address in downtown Cincinnati. I had to be careful. If I went to the police, I was complicit in hiding the original evidence. If I went to the mother and I was wrong, I was a lunatic groundskeeper harassing a grieving parent. But the handprint, the straightened marker, the split granite, I couldn't ignore it. I decided to call the funeral home first. Maybe they could confirm the specifics of the ceiling. Maybe the funeral director noticed something odd. I called the number listed on the file. A pleasant woman answered. "Good morning, Oak Haven Funeral Services." I identified myself as the groundskeeper at Oak Ridge and asked to speak to the director who handled the Elias Thorne service. "Oh, Mr. Riley," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "That was handled by Mr. Harrison, but he hasn't been in the office much since that burial. He took sudden medical leave." "Medical leave? What happened?" "I don't know the specifics, but he was quite shaken after that particular service. Said he felt a horrible pressure, a real sense of wrongness. He checked the seal on that casket 3 times. He was so worried. He just couldn't shake the feeling. He won't even talk about it." A feeling of wrongness. A horrible pressure. The funeral director felt it too. He sealed the coffin, and something about it terrified him so much he quit his job. Now I knew I had to go straight to the source. The mother. I left Frank a cryptic note. "Monument cracked. I'm taking the day. If anyone asks, I'm checking irrigation lines. I changed out of my work clothes, put on a simple collared shirt, and drove my old pickup truck toward Cincinnati. It took me an hour to find the address. It was a modest two-story house with overgrown hedges and a porch swing. The house looked tired, just like the woman who answered the door. Martha Thorne looked older than her file suggested. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she wore a faded black sweatshirt. "Mrs. Thorne? My name is Mike Riley. I work at Oak Ridge Memorial." Her face stiffened immediately, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. "Oh, is something wrong with the plot? I just ordered the permanent marker." "No, ma'am. The plot is fine. I needed to ask you a few difficult questions about Elias. I know this is hard, but it's important." She hesitated, then slowly opened the door wider. "Come in, Mr. Riley, but please be brief." We sat in her small, quiet living room. It was spotlessly clean, but filled with the heavy silence of recent death. "Mrs. Thorne," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I know Elias died in a car accident, but I need to know, were there any special circumstances surrounding his death? Did he suffer from any unusual illnesses? Was there any doubt about the timing of his passing?" She looked at me like I was insane. "Doubt? No. The police were clear. Instant trauma. The car was crushed. It was instant, thank God." "Why would you ask that?" "And the casket was closed. Why did you choose a closed casket?" She looked away, rubbing her hands together. "They recommended it. The accident. It wasn't pretty. He was disfigured. They said it would be better this way." "Mrs. Thorne, I apologize, but I have to ask this directly. Did Elias have any unusual habits? Did he ever talk about being afraid of the dark or of being buried?" Her eyes narrowed. "He was a boy, Mr. Riley. He was 22. He was afraid of student loan debt and bad beer." "What are you getting at?" I took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say it. "Mrs. Thorne, the ground over Elias's grave has been repeatedly and violently disturbed. We've sealed it twice, replaced the vault once, and now we've placed a 6,000-pound granite slab on top of it. And it's still moving. We found evidence inside the original sealed vault that suggests Elias was not at peace when he was sealed in that casket." I didn't mention the handprint yet. I watched her reaction. She stared at me for a long moment, then she started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a thin, hysterical sound that quickly turned into deep, shuddering sobs. "Not at peace?" she choked out, wiping tears from her eyes. "Of course he's not at peace. He hasn't been at peace for 6 months." She leaned forward, her eyes suddenly burning with frantic intensity. "Mr. Riley, you are right. There was something wrong with Elias, something deeply, terrifyingly wrong. It wasn't the car crash that killed him, not really. The car crash was the result." She paused, looking around the room as if worried someone was listening. "My son, he was an artist, a sculptor. 6 months ago, he started working on a piece. He called it The Vessel. He became obsessed. He started changing. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He would spend hours in the basement, just staring at the clay, talking to it, saying it was talking back." "Talking to the clay?" "Yes. He said the earth was angry, that it was calling him down. He started having these awful fits, screaming that he needed to be still, he needed to be quiet, he needed to be held." She shuddered. 2 weeks before the accident, he did something horrible. He tried to dig a grave in our backyard. He said he needed to sleep in the dirt just for a little while to calm the voices." "The voices?" "Yes, he was hallucinating, Mike. We tried to get him help. We had an intervention planned, but he kept saying, 'I need the earth to hold me down. I need to be still.'" "And the accident?" "He totaled the car, drove it straight off an embankment. The police ruled it an accident, but I know better. He was trying to stop the madness. He was trying to achieve the stillness he craved." She looked straight at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of grief and relief. He died seeking peace, Mr. Riley. And now, you're telling me that even 6 feet under, even sealed in concrete, he still hasn't found it? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Elias Thorne hadn't been fighting to get out because he was buried alive. He was fighting because the earth wouldn't hold him. Mrs. Thorne, I said slowly, when we buried him, was there anything placed in the casket with him? Any personal items? She nodded instantly. Yes, it was his greatest comfort and his greatest torment. He wouldn't part with it. I insisted it go in with him. What was it? A small, smooth river stone. He claimed it was the only thing that kept the voices quiet. He carried it everywhere, pressed tight in his left hand. The funeral director even put a little pillow under his hand so the stone would rest comfortably. A river stone. Pressed tightly in his left hand. I suddenly remembered the fingernail marks on the mahogany casket lid, right near the head, and the handprint on the satin lining. If he was buried with a stone in his hand, and that hand was pressing against the inside of the casket lid— Mrs. Thorne, I have to go, I said, jumping to my feet. I need to get back to the cemetery. Thank you. I drove back to Oak Ridge at breakneck speed. The problem wasn't a defect in the vault. The problem wasn't even Elias Thorne. The problem was whatever Elias Thorne carried with him, whatever was making the earth itself reject his presence. When I arrived back at Lot 44, Frank was already there, looking defeated, staring up at the cracked granite base. Mike, what the hell is that? Frank pointed to the center of the granite. I followed his gaze. The crack was wider now, and from the fissure, a small black line was creeping out. The familiar, sticky seepage. Frank, we have to dig it up, I said, my voice firm. We have to open the casket. We have to retrieve whatever he was buried with. I told Frank everything Martha Thorne had said, the madness, the voices, the river stone. Frank just listened, his jaw slack. The stone, Frank muttered. He's not fighting us, Mike. He's fighting the earth, and the earth is fighting back. We sealed him in, but that thing is drawing the ground into the vault. We didn't waste time arguing. We knew the drill now. We got the backhoe. We moved the cracked granite base, the ground screaming as the pressure was released. The earth beneath it was already mounded again, higher and wetter than ever. We dug down. We exposed the second vault. It was worse than the first. The concrete was heavily fractured, and the black seepage was pouring out of the cracks. We lifted the fractured lid of the second vault. The smell that erupted was overwhelming, a mix of metallic rot and hot, damp soil. I aimed my flashlight down. The mahogany casket was completely covered in black mud now. The thick blankets we had laid over it 2 weeks ago were ripped and soaked, and the lid of the casket was no longer just warped. It was split wide open, running diagonally from the center outward. Frank gasped, stumbling backward. Mike, look, he shouted, pointing the flashlight beam into the open crack of the coffin lid. The light illuminated the interior. The white satin lining was torn to shreds, and the body, Elias Thorne, was still inside, mostly obscured by the black sludge. But his left arm was thrust upward, bent sharply at the elbow, and his hand was pressed against the underside of the split lid. And in the center of his palm, glowing faintly in the dim light, was a smooth, dark river stone. It was pulsing. No, not pulsing. It was covered in that black, sticky seepage, and as we watched, the black fluid was retracting, being absorbed back into the surface of the stone, making it shine with a damp, unnatural slickness. We had to get that stone. I leaned over the edge of the pit, trying to reach the broken lid. As I moved, a small section of the earth near the head of the grave, the black, wet soil we had just excavated, began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. It wasn't settling. It was rising. A thick, ropey strand of black, muddy soil about the width of my arm extruded itself from the pile. It wasn't falling apart. It was coherent, like a living vine. And it was reaching for the open vault. It was reaching for the stone. Frank screamed. "Mike, get back! The ground!" The earth was trying to close the wound we had opened. It was trying to reclaim the thing we were trying to retrieve. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the longest, sharpest steel shovel we had, and I plunged it into the ropey black coil of earth. The shovel met resistance. Not the resistance of dirt, but the resistance of muscle and sinew. There was a sickening thwack, and the coil recoiled, snapping back into the pile of excavated soil. "Hurry!" Frank yelled. I scrambled back to the backhoe and lowered the bucket into the pit, using the edge to pry the broken coffin lid open further. I needed enough space to reach in. The mud was everywhere, coating the body, but the stone was visible. I grabbed the longest pair of tongs we had, the kind we used to handle hot asphalt, and leaned into the foul-smelling darkness of the vault. I clamped the tongs around the smooth, wet stone. As I pulled, Elias Thorne's hand, still clutching the stone, moved. Not just the hand, but the entire arm, covered in black sludge, lifted slightly, resisting my pull. I yanked harder. The tongs slipped, and the stone fell back into the coffin, landing with a soft, squelching sound on the body. At that exact moment, the ground around the open pit began to tremble violently. The sides of the hole, packed so tightly only hours before, started to collapse inward, raining chunks of wet black soil down onto the vault. We were running out of time. The earth was closing in. "The bucket!" Frank yelled. "Use the bucket to grab the whole thing!" I swung the backhoe arm, ignoring the collapsing earth, and plunged the heavy metal bucket straight into the open casket. I didn't care about the body anymore. I only cared about the stone. The bucket scooped up a heavy, foul mess of splintered wood, torn satin, black mud, and the remains of Elias Thorne. I lifted the bucket out of the grave, pulling it clear just as the walls of the pit gave way entirely, the entire hole collapsing into a deep, wet, churning sinkhole of black earth. The stone was in the bucket. I dropped the entire contents of the bucket, the fractured casket, the mud, the body, and the stone, onto the concrete floor of the maintenance shed. The stone rolled free. It was still slick with the black seepage, but it was glowing now, faintly, with a sickly green light. It was warm to the touch. Frank stared at the hideous mess on the floor, then at the glowing stone. "What do we do with it, Mike?" he whispered. "We can't bury it. The earth won't have it." "Then we destroy it," I said, grabbing the heaviest sledgehammer we kept for breaking up concrete. "We end this now." I raised the hammer, aiming for the smooth, wet surface of the stone. But as the hammer swung down, the stone didn't break. It didn't even crack. It screamed, and the scream wasn't sound. It was pressure. It was a wave of pure, cold force that hit my chest and slammed me backward against the wall of the shed. The lights flickered, and all the glass windows shattered outward. Frank was thrown to the ground, clutching his ears. When I finally pulled myself up, gasping for air, the stone was still intact, still glowing, sitting in the middle of the shredded coffin remains, and the black seepage was flowing off the stone, pooling on the concrete floor. The black fluid wasn't just liquid. As it spread, it began to coil, thickening, becoming the same ropey, coherent substance we had seen in the grave. It was forming a shape, a hand, a large black wet hand rising from the floor of the shed, reaching toward the glowing stone. The earth had found its way in, and it was trying to take back what we had stolen. I was thrown against the back wall of the maintenance shed, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The sledgehammer clattered onto the concrete floor, a useless piece of metal now. I heard the sickening sound of all the old glass panes in the shed shattering outward, showering the yard with shards. Frank was whimpering, curled up by the workbench, covering his head. I pulled myself up, chest burning, and looked at the stone. It didn't just survive the blow, it repelled it. It sat there, still glowing faintly with that sick green light, utterly unharmed, and the black seepage. It was no longer just liquid. It had spread across the floor, and now it was forming that same thick, ropey substance we'd seen in the grave. It was solidifying, rising up from the concrete floor like oil congealing into muscle. It was a hand, a large, dark, wet hand, rising from the floor, fingers elongating, reaching, slowly, deliberately, for the glowing stone. It was pure, distilled earth, angry and focused. "Mike, get out! Get out!" Frank screamed, scrambling backward toward the door. "No! If that thing touches the stone, we lose it!" I yelled back, grabbing the nearest thing I could, a long, heavy wooden handle from a broken rake. I couldn't touch the stone directly, not after seeing the reaction on the granite. I had to separate it from the ground's reach. The earth hand was moving slowly, but with relentless purpose. Its fingers were inches from the stone. I lunged forward, sweeping the rake handle across the concrete floor, knocking the stone away from the black sludge. It skittered across the floor, stopping near the steel drum we used for mixing concrete. The black hand stopped its advance, too. It swiveled, its muddy, sightless gaze somehow following the stone. Then, with surprising speed, the ropey fingers detached themselves from the main pool of sludge and began to crawl across the floor toward the stone again. "It wants it back, Frank! It wants the stone!" I shouted, desperation fueling my logic. "It's not fighting Elias, it's fighting that rock! It's what Elias put in the ground that the earth won't accept!" "Then give it back! Throw it in the hole!" Frank cried. "No! We tried that! We buried it twice! We sealed it! It just pushes it back out! We can't put it in the ground!" I looked around the shed frantically. The stone had to be contained, not by earth, not by wood, and not by mere granite. It had to be sealed completely away from the organic world. "Concrete!" I shouted. "We need concrete!" We were groundskeepers. We had bags of quick-setting concrete mix, gravel, and water right there for patching monuments. "Frank, the barrel, the mixer! Now!" Frank, shaking but obeying, stumbled to the industrial mixer we kept for large jobs. I grabbed the steel barrel we used for waste concrete and dragged it over. I used the rake handle to push the glowing stone into the empty steel barrel. It hit the bottom with a dull clank. The black seepage, sensing its quarry was enclosed, flowed faster now. The hand dissolved back into the main pool, and the entire mass of black sludge flowed across the floor, pooling around the base of the barrel, trying to creep up the sides. We had no time. I ripped open 3 bags of quick-set concrete mix, dumping the powder into the barrel around the stone. Frank grabbed the hose and turned the water on full blast. We mixed it right there in the barrel, plunging shovels into the thick gray slurry. The black seepage was flowing up the outside of the barrel now, seeking any seam, any weakness. As the water hit the concrete mix, the chemical reaction began, generating heat. The mix started to steam, and the heat was intense. When the wet concrete surrounded the stone, something happened. A muffled, high-pitched shriek came from inside the barrel. The concrete began to bubble violently like boiling tar. The glowing green light from the stone intensified, turning a sickly, blinding white for a moment. And then it vanished. The bubbling stopped. The heat remained, baking the concrete. The black seepage, which had climbed halfway up the outside of the barrel, stopped dead. It hesitated, then slowly, almost reluctantly, it began to retract. It flowed back down the steel sides, pooling on the floor, shrinking, until it was just a small, foul puddle near the shattered casket remains. Silence returned. A heavy, absolute silence. The kind of silence that tells you the fight is over, but not necessarily that you've won. We stood there, breathing hard, watching the barrel. Within minutes, the quick-set concrete was firm, hard, and hot. The stone was encased, sealed. "It's done," Frank whispered, wiping a mixture of sweat and tears from his face. "It's finally done." We stared at the mess we had made. The cracked granite base, the gaping sinkhole where Lot 44 used to be, the shattered shed windows, and the gruesome, muddy contents of Elias Thorne's casket spread across our floor. The piece of Oak Ridge was utterly shattered, but only Frank and I knew it. "We need to clean up," I said, my voice rough. "Now, before anyone sees." The problem wasn't just the shed, it was Elias Thorne. We couldn't put that body back into the ground. Not mangled like that, and not after the earth had made it clear it wanted nothing to do with him. Frank looked at the remains, then at me. His desperation was replaced by a grim, chilling resolve. "The incinerator," he said, nodding toward the old, rarely used industrial burner hidden in the far corner of the property, used only for diseased trees and massive construction debris. "We promised his dignity, Mike. We can't let him stay like this. We cremate him. We tell the family the vault was damaged beyond repair, and we handled the private cremation for free. It was illegal, unethical, and deeply disturbing. But Frank was right. We had crossed so many lines trying to maintain the illusion of peace, there was no going back to calling the authorities. We spent the next 4 hours in a haze of horror and frantic labor. We cleaned the shed, scrubbing the concrete floor until the black seepage was gone. We put the muddy, fractured pieces of the casket into the incinerator. And finally, with the utmost morbid respect, we placed the remains of Elias Thorne inside. Frank operated the burner himself. We watched the smoke rise, thin and gray, into the clear October sky. It felt like a final, awful cleansing. When it was over, we had a small container of ashes. "We tell Martha Thorne that due to the structural failure of the vault, we recommended immediate cremation and interment of the remains," Frank instructed, his voice flat. "It's the truth, mostly. We just omit the parts about the handprints and the screaming stone. Next, the grave site. We filled the enormous sinkhole with tons of fresh soil, tamping it down with such force that I thought the ground would complain again, but it remained silent. We leveled it perfectly. We replaced the cracked Taggart base with a normal temporary marker, citing extreme vandalism to the family and promising a replacement marker immediately. We told them the temporary one had been stolen, and the new marker would sit over the cremated remains, which we placed in a small, discreet urn deep beneath the new sod. The entire cemetery was back to normal by late afternoon. Lot 44 was flat, green, and quiet. But the real problem, the glowing stone, was still sealed in the steel barrel, sitting in the corner of the shed. "We can't leave it here," Frank said, running his hand over the hot, heavy concrete barrel. "If that thing starts pushing again, it'll crack the shed foundation." We agreed on a final resting place, the old abandoned limestone quarry 20 miles outside of town. It was a man-made hole, deep and vast, filled with stagnant water and surrounded by barren rock, as far from the living earth as we could get. That evening, under the dark cover of a moonless night, we loaded the 200-pound steel barrel onto the back of Frank's pickup truck. We drove slowly, silently, the weight of our secret pressing down on the springs of the vehicle. When we reached the quarry, the air was cold and still. We used the truck winch to slowly lower the barrel down a steep embankment until it hit the dark water with a heavy, final splash. It sank immediately into the black depths. We watched the ripples fade until the water was still again. "It's contained," Frank whispered. "It's gone." We drove back to Oak Ridge, 2 men bound by an impossible, horrifying truth. The next morning, Frank came into the shed looking exhausted but strangely peaceful. "We saved the cemetery, Mike," he said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "We maintained the peace." "At what cost, Frank?" I asked, looking at the repaired windows and the faint, permanent scrape marks on the concrete floor where the black hand had reached. "The cost of doing business," he replied, but his eyes were haunted. "We learned what happens when the earth doesn't want something back, and we made sure it got what it wanted: quiet." Frank continued to run Oak Ridge. He hired a new groundskeeper a month later, a young kid named Jerry who smelled of fresh laundry and optimism. Frank gave me a huge bonus and 6 weeks of paid leave. "You need a break, Mike," he told me simply. Go fish, go hike. Forget about the clay in lot 44. I took the leave, but I never went back. I couldn't. Every time I looked at a patch of sod, I saw Elias Thorne's ripped casket. Every time I saw a shadow, I remembered the sight of the earth forming a hand. I sent Frank a resignation letter 2 months later. I told him I was moving out west, seeking drier ground. He understood. I left Oak Ridge Memorial and that quiet, peaceful life behind. I never told anyone what happened. Not the police, not my ex-wife, not even Martha Thorne, who finally got her son's ashes interred peacefully under the new granite marker. But sometimes, when it rains hard and the ground softens, I feel a prickling sensation at the base of my neck. I feel the pressure. I live in Arizona now, in a small town where the soil is mostly sand and rock, baked hard by the sun. I work in a warehouse, moving boxes. It's loud, it's hot, and it's complicated. But it's far away from deep, wet earth. I sometimes think about that cracked granite slab, 6,000 pounds of rock split by a force from below. And I think about the steel barrel, sunk deep in the black water of that abandoned quarry. Is it still holding? Is the concrete still intact? I don't know. And I don't ever want to find out. Because I learned the hard way. When you're a groundskeeper, your job is to make sure the dead stay settled. And when the dead, or the earth itself, refuses to comply, the only thing you can do is run as far and as fast as you can. I was a cemetery groundskeeper. And one grave refused to stay closed. Now I just try to live a life where nothing is permanent and nothing is buried. It's the only way I can sleep at night.